Good Good morning, class 10. So, today we will be discussing a topic, a text that is a triumph of surgery, and it is written by James Herriot. And talking about James Herriot, his actual full name is James Alfred Wright, but actually known by the pen name James Herriot. He was a British veterinary surgeon and a writer, and he used his many years of experience as a veterinary surgeon to write a series of books, each consisting of stories about animals and their owners. And he is the best known for these semi autobiographical works, beginning with If Only They Could Talk in 1970. So, this story, The Triumph of Surgery, the story is about a dog named Tricky, who is the pet of a rich lady named Mrs. Pumphrey, and she loves her dog very much, and she is unable to refuse him anything to eat, anything he wants, anything he wants to eat. And Tricky is fond of eating cream, cakes, chocolates. So one day, when Mrs. Pumphrey is out of Tricky, is out with Tricky for a walk, then the narrator, that means Mr. Harriet, sees them and stops to talk. And while talking to Mrs. Pumphrey, he realizes that she has been overfeeding Tricky and also had been giving him things that he should not eat due to his Tricky had started looking like a bloated sausage, excessively fat. So soon Tricky got unwell and Mrs. Pumphrey has to call Mrs. Harriet because Mr. Harriet is a veterinary surgeon, that means the narrator, for help. So she doesn't want to send him away, but the only way suggested by Mr. Harriet is to get him hospitalized for 15 days. And then the story unfolds into how he, that means Tricky, gets well. Okay, so this is the story. So here in this part we will find that the narrator starts telling us that how he was worried about Tricky, the dog of Mrs. the pet dog, the pet of Mrs. Pumphrey, and Harriet stops his car as he sees Tricky with his mistress on the road, and the narrator is shocked to see Tricky because he looks like a bloated sausage, and that means excessively fat. And he was become very fat. His eyes were red and watery, and Mrs. Pumphrey is the Tricky's owner. She starts giving explanation. She told Mr. Harriet that she thought that Tricky was malnourished because he didn't have any energy and excitement. That's why she used to give him malt, hot liver oil, a bowl of Horlicks. Apart from his regular meals, he, although she gave him so much to eat, she says that she doesn't give him much to eat. Okay. Then the narrator asks her if she had cut down on his sweets as he asked her to do so, to which she replies that she didn't. She did it for a while, but she felt that she was getting weaker, because of which she had to stop being so harsh with him. And she also says that she is unable to refuse him cakes, chocolates, as those were his favorite. and he didn't know how to say no to food when his stomach is full. And the narrator was thought that all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey would not have mentioned which she fed Tricky. And again the narrator asked Mrs. Pumphrey whether Tricky was exercising. Then his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, replies that she doesn't take him out for a week. She does take him out for walk once in a while, but she is not playing his ring throwing exercise, as the gardener who takes him out to play is not coming these days because he is absent. Okay, so here in this part, the gist of the story is this. Now, here here in page number 2, we'll we find we found that we'll find that the narrator tried to talk seriously to Mrs. Pumphrey that if she did not control the Tricky's eating habits, and he would soon fall ill. And he told her that she should stay strong and strict with him and put him on a diet. Mrs. Pumphrey accepted that, and she knew that Mr. Harriot is right, but it was too difficult to her to refuse him for anything. Then she failed, she left the place, and because she was now ready to follow the new routine properly, and Mr. Harriot was watching them go and looking at Tricky's walking unsteadily, and the narrator was also looking at the tweed coat that Tricky was wearing. He had a wardrobe full of these coats and also raincoat for the rainy days. So this line also suggests that Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady and she had a lot of money to spend for his pet. But the narrator knew that soon he would be receiving a call about Tricky's falling ill, and the call has come. The call came after a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset as Tricky was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and was vomiting frequently. And he didn't even want to do anything. So, being a veterinary surgeon, and it was expected, and being a veterinary surgeon, the narrator knew that the only way to get Tricky well was to get him out of the house for a few days. That's why he suggested to Mrs. Pumphrey that if it would be good to get Tricky hospitalized and keep him under observation for 15 days. So after hearing this, Mrs. Pumphrey nearly fainted. She was sure that if Tricky not see her every day, he would surely die. But the narrator kept his word, and he told her that this was the only option as Tricky was very ill. And the narrator thought it would be the best to avoid any delays and get him to the hospital as soon as possible. And he went to their house, and even though Mrs. Pumphrey was crying because she didn't want her dog to go away from her, he took the dog, wrapped in the blanket, and put him in the car. Right. Here in this part, we will find that all the maids of Mrs. Pumphrey's house were then woken up and asked to get out all the tricky stuff. And his stuffs includes things like his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, his snacks bowl, and Mr. Harriot knew that so much stuff won't fit in his car, so he started rushing things. And as the doctor was leaving with Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey threw a lot of coats that Tricky used to wear in the car. And as the narrator was turning the car on the turn, he saw through the rear mirror that everyone was crying. He patted the little helpless animal, who responded by wagging his tail. That and the narrator then even thought and told Tricky that he knew that Tricky didn't have any energy, but he surely had a way to get him better. Right. Now here in this part we will find that as soon as they reached the hospital, all the other dogs so here in this part we will find that as soon as they reach the hospital, all the other dogs gather around them. That means gather around the doctor and Tricky. And Tricky looked at all the other animals, and when the doctor put him down on the carpet, he couldn't even move. And then the other dogs snipped him, and, and thought to themselves that he was very uninteresting object, and that's why there was no use to standing there, and they left the place. Then the narrator made a bed for Tricky in a warm box along with the other dogs. And for 2 days, the narrator kept him just on water and nothing else. The narrator didn't give him any food, any of the Tricky's favorite food, not even a single food, just only water. And on the second day, he roamed around looking at the place around him. And on the third day, he was also making noise to let the people in the hospital know that he too wanted to go out with the other dogs. And when the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was the greyhound, and his friends. And again, after sniffing him for a moment, all of them left for the garden where Tricky followed them. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially Tristan, as he was slopping the food, and all of them were eating with great speed because they knew that if they didn't finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing their meals, would come to eat their meals, right? Now, here in this page, in page number 4, we'll find that that when everybody finished their food, Tricky went around looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. And the very next day, an extra bowl was put for him, and the narrator was happy to see him running towards his bowl. Then he started getting better really quick. He didn't require any medicines and started playing with the other dogs for the whole day. And they all used to play with each other, walk over each other, and squash each other. And all the other dogs accepted him as a family members, although he was very different from others, as he was a very well taken care by his owner, and the others were not. He also used to fight for his males with his fellow dogs, and who were much larger in size than him. And at night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying, and he had never done such things before. And all this while, it's an interesting thing. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky, and Mr. Harriet used to avoid questions about the coats, beds, and he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering very fast. And Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover fast. She started sending dozen of eggs every day for him, but Mrs. Harriet and his partners would have two eggs each for the breakfast. Then to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started spending in bottles of wine. And then it became Mrs. Harriet's habit to have two glasses of wine before lunch and a few along with it. Now in here, the last part, the last part of the text. After that, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy, and at that time, Mrs. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. They shared it almost themselves, and some days Mrs. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and then ending of the day with brandy in the evening. Because of all these things that were being sent for Tricky, and Mr. Harriet was really tempted to keep him as a permanent guest at the surgery. He really wanted that Tricky should stay with them forever. But then he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to come back soon. So, so after 15 days, Tricky was ready to go back to home, and Mrs. Harriet called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him up. Within a few minutes, a long black car came outside, and when the chauffeur means driver, opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as pretty much excited, and she was asking with a nervousness in her voice that was Tricky really better? To which the doctor replied positively. Then Mr. Harriet went inside to get Tricky, and when Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs moving around the garden, and Tricky was sitting between them. And he had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was touching the ground. and he was become a good muscular dog within 2 weeks. And when Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that the driver was still holding the door of the car, and as soon as he saw his mother like mistress, he was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey, and he started licking her face with excitement. And while all this was happening, the driver and Mrs. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car, which had not been used during the treatment in the last 14 days. And when Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window. She leaned out of the window and said to Mrs. Harriet with tears of joy in her eyes that she could not thank him enough for what he had done. And she told that this is a triumph of surgery. That means the treatment that was given to Tricky that had been successful. Okay, this is the story. Please go through the text. Thank you.